Today is Friday, May 4th, and I welcome you all to the state's premier civic affairs event. I'm Melody Rose. I'm the president of City Club, and I'm very glad to welcome all of you here today. Those of you here with us at the Governor Hotel, those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio, and those of you watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Today we will learn about domestic violence, a topic that all too often goes unaddressed in our community. But first, a few announcements. City Club's corporate and media partners are essential to all of the good work that we do at the club. I'd like to offer our generous media partners a thank you, including Oregon Business Magazine. I also wish to extend our deep appreciation to the Friday Forum spring season corporate sponsors, including ESCO Corporation, Morel Inc., Northwest Natural, and Schwabe Williamson and Wyatt. We are very grateful for your support. And as always, if your company or firm would like to participate in the corporate sponsorship program, please do see our staff who are here with us today, or pop into the City Club offices. City Club's New Leaders Council turns 10 this year, and they are celebrating on May 16th with a party at the Davis Street Tavern. We hope you can join us for this celebration. I know I will be there. Not a group to rest on its laurels, NLC is also hosting 2 tours in the month of May, one at the Hoyt Arboretum and one at the Native American Youth and Family Center. You can find information on all 3 of these events at our website, pdxcityclub.org. And there's more. NLC is also pleased to announce that their very successful mentorship program, now in its 2nd year, is accepting new applicants. This program pairs 2 City Club members based on personal or professional interests in order to build new relationships in the club and connect civically minded mentors and mentees across areas of interest, expertise, and experience. If you are interested in participating in NLC's mentorship program, a City Club staff member would be delighted to tell you about it. Following today's talk, we will be welcoming City Club members to the microphone for a Q&A session with our speakers. In addition, we invite all of the audience members here at the Governor Hotel to locate the index cards on your tables and write questions there. During the board host question, I will ask you to raise up the index cards high and the staff will come around and collect them and I can read some of them. I'm sure you all have very good questions today. And now to our program. Over the past 5 years, more than 85,000 women and men in Oregon have experienced domestic violence. Those trapped in violent relationships often feel ashamed of their situation and often are very reluctant to come forward. Today we will hear from a panel of experts who will give voice to the lives and concerns of those affected by domestic violence and will discuss community, police, and court responses. Our first speaker today is Chiquita Rollins. Dr. Rollins, one of the state's premier authorities on domestic violence, has 30 years of experience in the field. She is currently a consultant on domestic violence and housing. As Multnomah County's domestic violence coordinator for 17 years, she oversaw staffing of the Family Violence Coordinating Council and administration of a $4 million budget. She also served as the lead policy and planning expert for the county and the city of Portland on domestic violence intervention and prevention. Our second speaker, Greg Stewart, is a sergeant with the Portland Police Bureau. His assignments have included supervising the Domestic Violence Reduction Unit, the Crime Analysis Unit, as well as supervising officers at North and Central precincts. Sergeant Stewart has presented both nationally and internationally on issues surrounding domestic violence. He has trained police in Bangladesh in community policing and has worked with officers in Ukraine and Mexico on issues around domestic violence. Today's final speaker is Maureen Mcknight, the Chief Family Court Judge in Multnomah County, Oregon, handling family, juvenile, and criminal matters. Her legal career, both before her appointment to the bench and since, has focused on systemic family law issues affecting low-income Oregonians, including operation of the state's child support program, access to justice issues such as self-representation, and the response of Oregon's communities to domestic violence. Judge Mcknight is a member of the Oregon Judicial Department's Family Law Advisory Committee. And with that, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Chiquita Rollins.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Melody, for the nice introduction, and I want to thank the City Club for inviting us to come and speak to you today about this issue, and thank you all for coming to listen to us. The panel, we have about 70 years of experience on domestic violence, and so we are going to distill that into 45 minutes. If we talk too fast, please forgive us. So, I want to start by telling you, in case you don't know, 15 years ago in 1997, the City Club issued a report on domestic violence called Domestic Violence, Everybody's Business. It's an excellent report. I recommend that if you haven't read it recently, you download it from the City Club website and you read it. It was an important thing to have come out when it did. It was welcomed and used by those of us in the community who are advocating for additional services for victims of domestic violence or stronger police and criminal justice response. And it was subsequent, and many of the subsequent efforts that came about were due to the report and also to the lobbying and advocacy efforts by the members of the City Club who chose to be involved in those. Since the report, the prevalence of domestic violence crimes, including domestic violence, has decreased significantly. However, as in 1997, domestic violence remains 42% of all reported violent crimes in the city of Portland, far outstripping any other single source of assaults. And in most years, it is the most common cause of homicides in the county. But domestic violence is more than a violent crime. It is an attempt by the perpetrator to establish or maintain control over their partner. The abuser or perpetrator uses a range of tactics. Some are criminal, such as physical or sexual assault, stalking, or threats. Some are not criminal, such as manipulation, psychological or emotional abuse, forced isolation of the victim, threats or actions to harm the victim's reputation, including her ability to work or leave the house. It is generally a pattern that is intended, as the City Club report says, to, quote, defend real, material, and psychological benefits, end of quote, that the perpetrator derives from it. The actions by the perpetrator are purposeful and they are utilitarian. And as you can see, domestic violence is not just one thing, and each domestic violence situation is a complex mix of the tactics of the perpetrators and the resistance of the victim to the attempts to control her. And separation from a perpetrator is a complex and dangerous situation. Perpetrators often escalate their violence, stalking, or abuse upon separation or threat of separation. In addition, some victims face very high barriers to safety and ongoing stability. And as I'm sure you are aware of, poverty has a disparate impact on women and children and on women of color. Actions by the perpetrator have further impoverished or otherwise disadvantaged some survivors. They have lost jobs, been saddled with debt, or have a terrible credit or rental history due to the very actions of the perpetrator. That means that our response to domestic violence and victims and perpetrators must focus on victim safety, and address the specific range of services and needs of that individual victim or perpetrator. No one solution will work for every victim, and sometimes there is no easy or foolproof plan or way to safety for the victim. I'm now going to talk to you a little bit about the 1997 report, the priority recommendations, and where we are with those recommendations. So the first recommendation was to double emergency shelter capacity and services for victims of domestic violence. We have not doubled the emergency shelter capacity. We have not increased the emergency shelter capacity at all. However, we've increased victim services in an array of places and in a variety of venues. We developed culturally specific programs that did not exist in 1997 for African Americans, Hispanics, Southeast Asians, sexual minorities, immigrants, and refugees and Native Americans. We have increased rent assistance and other longer-term housing supports. Volunteers of America have developed a national model for housing first for survivors of domestic violence because of the efforts to increase those resources. We've increased access to non-shelter-based services in a variety of ways, from mobile advocates to go where the victims are, advocates co-located at common venues for other kinds of services such as public assistance, child welfare, the courthouse, and our Safe Start project, which is co-located victim advocates in the child welfare office in Gresham, is a model, has been called a promising practice by the U.S. Department of Justice. The city and county have opened the Gateway Center for Domestic Violence Services, which is a multi-service center bringing together an array of services for victims, both victim advocacy and other community services. Funding for domestic violence victim services has increased since 1997 at the local, state, and federal level. So that's the first recommendation. The second recommendation, increase prosecution rates for abusers, make repeat assaults a felony when repetition of abuse occurs. So the legislature did increase misdemeanor assaults and strangulation to low-level felonies in cases where children were present or there had been prior convictions for domestic violence. We have also increased our ability to identify and respond to the highest risk perpetrators and those who repeat incidents of domestic violence through the police department and the Domestic Violence Enhanced Response Team, and Sergeant Stewart's going to be talking some more about those efforts. However, I did want to say that DIVERT, the Domestic Violence Enhanced Response Team, has been recognized and is one of the most successful collaborative projects combining community-based victim advocates with criminal justice players such as the police, the prosecutors, and the community corrections. The third recommendation was to require healthcare and social service professionals to provide information to suspected victims of domestic violence. This has not been accomplished. However, most of the large healthcare providers have some capacity to screen for and assist victims of domestic violence. The fourth recommendation is to increase public awareness of domestic violence and provide training for professionals. Thousands of professionals have received training offered by the County Domestic Violence Coordination Office. In recent years, monthly trainings were presented by this office on a range of topics, and we were able to bring in 2 to 3 nationally recognized experts each year. These trainings have generally focused on criminal justice, social service, and domestic violence. On the downside of the priority, existing funding for school-based prevention has been cut. The fifth recommendation, improved data collection and reporting for domestic violence. Partial success there. For 5 or 6 years, the state police did actually collect and disseminate data, statewide data on police reports and arrests. However, that has ended, and there appears to be no attempt to resurrect that. However, you will see that the Portland police have great data on domestic violence, and there's better data on restraining orders. So when I look over this list, based on my 30 years of experience and my 20 years of experience here in Multnomah County, what I see is we have built an impressive response to domestic violence in Portland and Multnomah County, with a wide range of services that in many ways embody the idea of victim-centered services and flexibility. It is a national model at the state level and the national level in many fronts. We have also put together collaborations and services that were not even envisioned in 1997. An uncounted number of domestic violence survivors and their children are safer and in more stable living situations than before. So what are the challenges we face? I couldn't leave you with just all the good news, you know. So, domestic violence intervention services system remains overwhelmed with the need, underfunded, and threatened by ongoing cuts to government-funded services. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody in the audience. Shelters are almost always full. There may be only 1 or 2 beds per month that come open in the emergency shelter system here. The probation office, the domestic violence unit, has the highest caseload and has had to limit the supervision of the so-called lower-level domestic violence offenders who have been convicted. The City of Portland is considering cutting 2 of the domestic violence reduction unit officers, even though their current caseload is almost undoable. And at the federal level, the Violence Against Women Act, which funds shelters, victim services, and transitional housing, is once again slated for a significant cut. We are also faced with some widespread systemic challenges, and the societal forces that impede our ability to end domestic violence are at the intersection of race, class, and gender. All of these areas in which there is still large disparities and biases. Women still only make 70% of what men make. They are more likely to be poor and to face foreclosure. People of color, and thus the women of colors, are faced with racial discrimination and disadvantage and economic and health disparities. So the economic downturn of 2008, depression, recession, whatever you want to call it, has forced people, especially women and people of color, out of their homes, reduced incomes, increased unemployment, and made housing much harder to afford or to come by. This, in turn, has made it more difficult for domestic violence victims to separate from their perpetrators and to find stable housing. Unfortunately, current housing policy and funding priorities prioritize ending homelessness, which further disadvantages domestic violence victims. Domestic violence victims and women in general are unlikely to be considered homeless because they can't get into a shelter, there aren't any beds, and they are unwilling to live on the streets or have their children live on the streets. Instead, they end up in unstable or dangerous places. Secondly, victims are still viewed with suspicion or blame for domestic violence, and perpetrators are too often given a pass. For example, women, not the perpetrator, are blamed for the domestic violence that their children are exposed to. Sometimes perpetrators are even considered good fathers, even though they have purposely injured their children's mother and perhaps decreased her ability to care for her children. There is a belief, and even held by some in the court system, that women lie about domestic violence in order to get custody of their children or to punish an ex or a cheating partner. However, I believe that perpetrators are more likely to use the court system against victims in ways that basically are lies also. There's also a belief that women just go back to the abuser and that there's something wrong with these women because they do that. However, in our recent Center for Disease Control study, we found that less than 3% of women after 18 months are with an abuser, and after 6 months, less than 5% were with an abuser. So they don't go back. And domestic violence is still seen as, quote, a relationship problem with joint responsibility, or perhaps the perpetrator has a communication problem or is overstressed due to unemployment or other problems. And that batterers or domestic violence offenders are not the real criminals. So, what can we do? And what would I like you to do more specifically? I have many things that the rest of us can do, but what would I like the City Club and the City Club members to be doing? First of all, I suggest that you update the report, that you form a committee and do the very intensive and objective and in-depth study that you did the last time around 15 years ago. And secondly, I suggest that you continue to host speakers who can speak to the wide range of issues that are linked to domestic violence. We can barely touch the surface of everything that we could say to you. As individuals, I would like to suggest again that you read the report, especially the executive summary and the background part of it. And secondly, that you help policymakers continue their support for domestic violence services and intervention and encourage those that are not so supportive to change their position, in other words, to lobby. So one issue, to let the police leadership and the city commissioners know that you want to see the domestic violence unit in the police department to remain fully staffed and that cutting 2 officers from that unit is unacceptable to you. Secondly, to advocate for continued funding of the Violence Against Women Act at the federal level. Thirdly, to ask Commissioner Nick Fish, as he looks at the homelessness plan, the reset of the homelessness plan, to make sure that domestic violence victims remain or are moved to high priority populations and are not further disadvantaged by a focus on the literal legal definition of homelessness. And thirdly, just simply to ask questions in any policy discussion that you're involved in around how does this apply to domestic violence? Will it make victims safer or will it make them less safe? And will it help deter perpetrators of domestic violence? On your table, I believe there are business cards from Annie Neal, who's the new domestic violence coordinator for the county, and she can provide you with much more in-depth information about current statistics in the system and current responses or current threats to funding for the system. And if you don't have one, she's sitting someplace over there. Okay. And what I want to leave you with is that I want you to remember that there are thousands of women and children in our community are safer and lead richer and more stable and fulfilling lives than before because of the work that we do and because of your prior advocacy. So please join us in making sure that more victims receive the same opportunity to lead safe and stable lives. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for having me. It's always difficult to follow Chiquita. She's been a rock in the domestic violence unit for quite some time, and equally difficult to be followed by Judge Mcknight, whose knowledge on this issue is immense. For my part, I've got a little bit to add, largely because of my history in the police bureau. As mentioned before, I've supervised both the domestic violence unit and the crime analysis unit. Those two positions have given me a unique perspective on this issue. While at the domestic violence unit, I saw both domestic violence offenders who were among the worst criminals in our city. We, working with Dr. Henning from PSU, established a system to help us prioritize folks based off of how likely they were to recidivate. And our highest priority offenders would often have 20 or 30 prior arrests. They'd have extensive gang involvement, extensive involvement in drugs, weapons, and alcohol. But those were just the ones we knew about. Domestic violence has a disproportionately large impact on public safety. And this impact is very poorly understood, even or perhaps especially by those of us in law enforcement. To make sense of this misappreciation of risk, we need to understand how we assess risk in general. In the early 1970s, psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky began the study of heuristics and biases in human judgment. This study revolutionized both psychology and economics, leading to a Nobel Prize. Among the heuristics identified by the pair, and particularly relevant to domestic violence, is the availability bias. Simply put, when people try to assess risk, those types of risks which are most easily recalled are judged the most prevalent. In this age of intensely competitive 24-hour-a-day media coverage, crimes such as terrorism, gang violence, stranger danger, and even crimes associated with transit systems such as crimes on the TriMet dominate the news. While all of this crime exists, the reality is that none of them, even gang violence, have the broad societal impact of domestic violence. However, because until recently domestic violence was seen as a family matter, and as a society we have a history of sweeping it under the rug, we still don't understand just how pervasive this problem is. Just how widespread is domestic violence? As Chiquita mentioned, as recently as 2011, 42% of assaults in the city of Portland were related to domestic violence. That's actually an improvement. If you go back to 2001, domestic violence accounted for 48% of all assaults in the city of Portland, and 56% of those assaults coined simple assaults, which are normally the less serious misdemeanor assaults, and 34% of aggravated assaults, which is the most serious classification of assaults, including assaults with weapons. Homicides, in most years, a quarter of all homicides are related to domestic violence. Again, in terms of serious violence, only gangs can even come close to comparing with the impact of domestic violence, and even then, domestic violence is more prevalent in total numbers. And if, like me, you've studied crime, you quickly realize the distinction between gang and domestic violence is spurious. When we've analyzed gang violence and its intersection with domestic violence, not surprisingly, they co-occur. In one review, we found among our most prolific offenders, nearly 32% had a history of gang involvement. Individuals in the city of Portland with a history of gang involvement account for less than 0.5% of this total population. But as mentioned before, they account for 32% of our prolific offenders and nearly 5% of domestic violence crimes in general. This group is misrepresented both in terms of numbers and severity of offenses. Sadly, but perhaps not surprisingly, violence begins at home. Now some relatively good news. Through a tremendous amount of hard work and dedication by community groups, advocates, members of the city and county councils, and the criminal justice system, we have made some headway. The number of assaults for domestic violence has shrunk from over 3,600 assaults, nearly 10 a day, in 2001 to 2,500 in 2011, a nearly 30% decrease. As I mentioned, a portion of domestic violence assaults has fallen from 48% of all assaults to 42% of all assaults, meaning we've been successful at reducing the number of domestic violence assaults faster than other assaults. But let's think about that for a sec. The quote-unquote good news is that only 42% of assaults are related to domestic violence. I find that number unacceptable. And I'd go so far as to say I don't believe the average citizen would find that number unacceptable if they were made aware of it. That's why venues such as the one you're hosting today are so important. When we discuss the availability of a bias, what we're going to see is that because domestic violence has this history of being swept under the rug, and because domestic violence is unpleasant, we don't want to discuss it. It's much easier in forums like this to discuss gang violence or terrorism, where the people who perpetrate those crimes can be seen as the other. They're not ourselves. With domestic violence, the offenders can be any of us, making it much more difficult to address. And while I would not say that the public likes crime or criminals, it seems to me that certain types of crime capture the imagination in ways that make them more noticeable. Images of gangsters in the popular media, shows such as Sons of Anarchy or Goodfellas, a history in America of reverence for the outlaw, Billy the Kid, have all made gangsters and outlaws a more attractive group to study or to emulate. Terrorism, as the name implies, has had a dramatic impact on how we police in America today. At the federal level, it's reshaped how the federal government responds to crime and its priorities. This is despite the fact that the chance of a terrorist attack hurting or killing you in this room or a loved one is infinitesimally small when compared with the chance of that same assault or killing being related to domestic violence. When you look at it in terms of priority of resources versus prevalence of the problem, gang violence, terrorism, quote-unquote stranger danger are all vastly funded in terms of the prevalence of the crimes relative to their impact. Again, if you're to watch the news, you would think that it was suicide to get on a TriMet bus or a MAX train. The way we report these crimes simply is all out of proportion with the impact they have on us. Domestic violence victims are silent. They're not in a position to be interviewed, to recount their stories. And even if they were, we really often don't want to face the problem, so we simply decide to ignore it. Before coming up here, I was speaking with one of our hosts, and they were mentioning how several people had come to them and talked about how having a forum for domestic violence is a bummer, or, and they were very supportive of the cause themselves, but they were relating how people had come to them and said, well, this is not, this is unexciting. This isn't how I want to spend my lunch. This is really depressing. And that seems to be, what domestic violence faces. If I go into a presentation on gang violence, all kinds of people will come and want to learn about gang violence, despite the fact that the chance of gang violence impacting them or a loved one is, while more than, say, terrorism, is still really small compared to domestic violence. But perhaps because it strikes so close to home, people don't want to address this problem. And because of that, the problem's going to remain. Even the numbers I've given you really underestimate the scope of this issue. I've been using reported crime. Again, probably of no surprise to most people in this room. Most domestic violence isn't reported. The numbers we capture are small relative to the overall problem. And again, contrast that with, say, terrorism. If there's even a hint of a terrorism incident in this nation, anywhere, even, somebody relatively incompetent, caught, it's going to be all over the news. But we don't know, we know only a small fraction of the total volume of domestic violence that occurs. And even that, in the criminal sense, as Chiquita said, is really limiting. I was recently working the street. Because of my position, I don't actually do much police work anymore. I count a lot of things. So every so often, I try to go out and actually put on a uniform, which is scary, and it doesn't fit. But I was out there working the street in my really poorly fitted uniform, and took a call, and I'm going up, and I can't mention the area, but it's a very affluent area, very affluent, and met by a very intelligent, affluent person, terribly upset. The father of her son had taken the child, was out of state, and she was afraid that child was being abducted. And this is literally within the last 2 or 3 months. The individual's partner was very reputable, a very high status job, But the person was also a domestic violence offender. The actual criminal violence, in terms of maybe being able to arrest them, was infrequent. In fact, almost never. In this case, the actual physical violence was years old. But that person could use that threat of violence and more effectively the threat of taking the couple's children to control his partner. This led to a family where the entire family tiptoed around this one individual under constant stress about aggravating or upsetting the family patriarch. This man's home literally was a kingdom, and he was a despot. Criminally, again, me and my partner, there was not much we could do, but it's important to reiterate that this is still domestic violence. I can come in here and paint a picture of domestic violence offenders similar to gang offenders. If I was to come in and tell you that our priority 1 offenders are suspects in 32 crimes on average, have been arrested 20 times on average, have 10 violent criminal incidents on average, a third of them are gangsters, 3/4 of them have gun arrests, I could paint a picture of domestic violence as the other, as the person that's not in this room. I mean, I could even if I really wanted to, probably romanticize what they do to a certain extent, so that you might, seeing them as the other, be more inclined to villainize them. But the reality is that that's just one small slice of domestic violence. And it's important that we understand that despite 50 years plus of women's liberation, we are working against thousands of years of patriarchy and male privilege. Before I go, I want to make one more point. And like most crime, domestic violence over the last 10 years has reduced. Unfortunately, it looks like that trend may be ending. Domestic violence crime is up nearly 6% citywide, and astoundingly, aggravated assaults are up 36%. There is still much work to be done, and I hope that folks, when they leave here today, will want to take up and engage in some of that work with us. And thank you very much for having me.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, City Club, for inviting us today. My role is to speak about domestic violence from the perspective of someone involved in the legal system, not just the criminal arm, the criminal court arm, but also the family and juvenile courts. Like my fellow panelists, I've been involved in domestic violence work for several decades, and we've seen it evolve from what was essentially a grassroots movement of crisis lines, shelters, and safe homes to a real variety of public and private programs. And the range, I think, of those programs now reflects the true needs that domestic violence victims and children have. Public funding, though inadequate, has certainly had an impact in the growing awareness about domestic violence, and it is still growing, and also, I think, community investment in it. There are more people at the table now when domestic violence is discussed, and I think that's just an incredibly good thing. But just as the cast of players has evolved, I think, too, that we have sharpened our focus somewhat in looking at domestic violence. I believe at this point we're struggling somewhat to differentiate among the types of violence that we know can be perpetrated, and trying to fashion interventions that are appropriate for the specific persons involved, specific for the perpetrator and what the particular victim needs. If I had a theme today to my remarks, it would be that every relationship is different, and we need to look at domestic violence in the context of the specific parties that we have and craft a response that's appropriate for that victim, for those children, and for that perpetrator. There really is no one answer for domestic violence. And I want to clarify that I'm not suggesting that I think there are typologies that are defining individual perpetrators and individual victims where we can neatly categorize them and their families. The lines just are not that clear. There certainly is a difference between classic battering and the pattern of control, intimidation, coercion, which is what we're predominantly talking about here. But there are some instances of situational violence where it really is an aberration and it's not part of an ongoing pattern. Overall, those are a small part of what we see. There is also violence that is reactive and resistive to a pattern of battering when a victim has tried appeasement or threats or something else in self-protection before resorting to violence him or herself. We also have antisocial violence that comes from disordered individuals who are indiscriminate in their use of violence, any setting, any person, any time, part of an ingrained behavior and not likely to change. So when I describe these kinds of things, they may seem like they're different types, but in reality, they're not mutually exclusive. It's exceedingly difficult, particularly where a responder, where a judge has a limited amount of time and perhaps limited facts to draw distinctions about what's going on in a particular case. If you take, for example, a situation where a perpetrator who, in an uncharacteristic mode for that person, has acted out in an aggressive or assaultive mode, but it hasn't happened again, how hard or how easy is it to distinguish from a batterer who maybe has used violence only once, but only has needed to use it once because it's that thread of ongoing memory that is used to control and intimidate the victim without having to use violence again. Those are tough calls, depending on what facts you have before me. It may not be the right call that I or others are making. Those cases may look each like aberrations, but they may not be. Think, too, of a situation of a violation of a restraining order, someone driving by a home when they're under a court order to stay a certain distance away from the other party. That may look like not like a fairly insignificant violation. It doesn't involve violence, you say. How big can it be? But if you're in a situation where the control is the large issue, the respondent in that case recognizes the car of someone else he's jealous about to be with a former partner, that driving by can actually precipitate some and signal some very serious risk concerns. So, and I want to underscore that the fact that we might even have some attempts at differentiation doesn't diminish at all the danger that every type of violence poses for victims. So while I think trying to analyze the violence is really important, it's just as important that we take care in that task. And I think that assessment is one of the biggest challenges the legal system has right now in terms of dealing with domestic violence. But it's also critical to understand the goals of the particular victim. Many people want to reunite. Many people plan to separate. Those plans can change. We all know that it can be a process in terms of returning and separating again. There was family law judges do have some national forums in which some of us are able to attend, and I think it's significant that the identical question was posed to several of those forums and resulted in nearly identical answers, and that was that 60% of women who appeared before us as family court judges intended to maintain a relationship with their abuser. And that may not be our reaction when a friend, a family, a neighbor comes to us to disclose domestic violence or seek help, because it's pretty darn easy to get to that, well, I sure as heck wouldn't stay kind of reaction. And we could talk for several hours about why women stay or go back. But the point being, it's a very fluid, complex dynamic, and safety needs can change. And what I think is most important is that every portal that a victim accesses, every encounter that a perpetrator has, gives the same message, and that to the victim is that we are here if we need you, and this is what we can offer you. These are our informed, this is the information we can give you about choices. That consistency of message is one of the things we've discussed here at the courthouse. It's one of the reasons we consolidated several dockets about handling misdemeanors and restraining order violations. We wanted to make sure that we had the judges who were handling domestic violence in a variety of contexts handling those criminal cases as well, so that our orders that dealt with no contact, perhaps in a restraining order case didn't conflict with what was going on if that same person had assaulted a partner, or an order that we had in a child custody case took into account the services that we might require in juvenile court if the Department of Human Services Child Welfare had to step in. We wanted to make sure that if youth were charged with law violations for assaulting girlfriends or family members, that we had interventions that perhaps their parents didn't have. So about 875 cases were added we readjusted caseloads and assignments at the court to put into the family court. And I can tell you, as a judge on a one family, one court model, where I hear all of the cases, be it probation, criminal, family, juvenile, for a given family, it's an exceedingly rare day where I don't have a case involving domestic violence in front of me. There's a lot to do in the domestic violence arena in the criminal courts. I'm not going to just mention a couple issues. Victim participation certainly is one. Risk assessments, I know Greg has talked about that. We're in discussions with the Department of Community Justice about how to incorporate victim voice into instruments, risk assessments, given the fluidity of domestic violence. But although there's a lot to do on the criminal side, I think the role of the court there is fairly clear. Victim safety, community safety, batterer accountability. I think on the family law side, actually, there is a much more significant tension, and that's between that same imperative for safety and what is a more traditional model of parental access and contact. They're inconsistent in terms of domestic violence cases, and a lot of what we do is to pierce the facts to try to understand the historical context in a way that isn't always possible in a narrow look in a criminal case, so that we have a full understanding of the domestic violence proceedings. And that tension is amplified in family court because over 3/4 of family law litigants do not have attorneys. There is about half go against another self-represented parent, and the other half go against one attorney. But there's no guarantee that all the relevant facts are getting to us in the family court. I think the need for representation, for civil legal assistance, is profound in this area. There are some volunteer programs, but I think it remains a significantly unmet need. As Greg mentioned, crime rates are dropping. Restraining orders are on a downward slide statewide, a gradual drop, but I think it is significant that the same rate that Greg mentioned in terms of an slight upward trend now is reflected exactly in the restraining order filings. After 15 years of downward trend in this county, we had a 6.2% increase in restraining order filings this year, almost pretty close to what Greg looked at here. During the same period, though, even though numbers have gone down, the family court has allocated more time to hearing restraining order cases, precisely because we know how important these are to families, the need to have clear rules for vulnerable populations, not just children, but elder and disabled people. We're also working with the Gateway Center and the city on interactive restraining order forms. Think TurboTax, where you can go online, answer specific questions, and the answers are print out in a legal form that then can be electronically filed in the courthouse. We're really excited about that. We're also working with Commissioner Saltzman's office on exploring the identification of firearm use in restraining order cases and facilitating surrenders and protocols. I want to close, if I can, with a theme that I remind myself of regularly, and that is that the study of effective intervention in domestic violence is about 20 years behind that of substance abuse and sex offenses. We do know some things regarding domestic violence, but what we don't know is massively greater. I think what is clear, though, is that there's never going to be a single intervention that's the answer to all situations. And what we need, and while we need to try to understand and assess individual situations, we have to continue to provide a variety of portals, a whole range of services, and an array of approaches if we're going to be effective at all in being protective of our families. So thank you for listening today, and I'll turn this back to our host.
Thank you all so much. You've given us quite a lot to think about and to discuss. If you've written a question on an index card, now is the time to raise it up high until the staff retrieves it from you. They'll bring it up here to me. The first question for our speaker, as always, comes from our Friday Forum host, today, Pat McCormick. For 20 years, Pat was a partner at Conkling, Fiscum & McCormick, a public affairs, research, and public relations firm. Now he's a partner in AM/PM PR, a Portland relations firm he founded with his daughter, Allison. Pat has been a City Club member since 1969.
Thank you to our panel for an enlightening presentation, and Dr. Rollins, I especially want to thank you for recalling the role of City Club research and advocacy in drawing public attention to these issues. You also invited the City Club to take another look. If we were to issue another report, could the panelists answer the question, what would be your highest priority recommendation you'd like to see in the City Club report on domestic violence today?
Gosh. So I'm going to skip some of the obvious ones because I think they will be recommendations and sort of go down to my private little rant I have occasionally about looking at brain injury and strangulation among victims of domestic violence, where I'm sure you all know that boxers have brain injury and that's a problem. Football players have brain injury and that's a problem. But very, very few of the brain injury researchers pay any attention to the fact that battered women have brain injury from strangulation, from having their heads knocked against the wall or the floor, from being struck hard either with a closed fist or an open hand. And I think it's something that needs to be addressed and thought about at the medical level, at the police level in investigation, and also at the level of how we deal with domestic violence survivors and the impact of brain injuries have on them.
Other thoughts from the panel?
I would have two thoughts, one of which is kind of Chiquita's expertise, but I think housing is a huge issue. We mentioned briefly why survivors of domestic violence don't leave, and at least in my experience as a police officer, it really never surprised me that folks didn't leave because often there were children involved, and if the choice was between staying in an abusive relationship and being personally abused but having your children have shelter and living on the streets, I was not surprised that folks chose to take care of their children as best they could. So increasing and particularly longer term housing options I think would be important. And the second piece is, and it's just something I've recently started exploring, but expanding studies around the trauma and domestic violence and how, I know from a police perspective, I don't think we have a really good understanding or training base around how to treat the victims of this crime, and I think more training expertise in that area would benefit the frontline police response.
And I think my response, grounded in terms of a legal perspective, though I certainly agree with the points that my fellow panelists made, are probably those that I highlighted in my own remarks. I think certainly funding for victim services and what we see in terms of the need for representation for individuals wanting to leave and needing legal help in doing that is a very significant one. And I also think as a community, having a facilitated discussion about how we can meaningfully assess and have victim voice in a process that assesses the violence that's presented to us as judges who need to make decisions in a case. Those would be my priorities.
Okay, thank you. Sounds like you've given us a charge. We will now take questions from the floor. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their question, and asking questions at the microphone is a privilege of City Club membership. So please state your name, tell us that you're a club member, and ask your question in under 30 seconds. I'll also make sure we get answers to some of the questions from the index cards.
Leslie Moorhead, City Club member and member of the Board of Governors. I want to ask Chiquita to speak at a little bit more length about the Violence Against Women Act, and I have a specific question and a general question. The specific question is, apparently one of the, I guess, many reasons the legislation that's currently on the floor of the House is being held up is that for some reason there's supposedly people carving out an exemption that the law wouldn't apply to certain groups of women, namely Native American women, lesbians, and immigrants, presumably illegal immigrants. And that just baffles me. I just can't imagine anybody thinking that. But do you know if there's any commonality or any logical reason that those three groups would be lumped together? And secondly, what is your prognosis for the passage of the law? What do you think is going to happen?
Okay, so I actually can't help you much with the exemptions other than to say that there's some pretty wacko people in the Senate and the Congress these days. But hopefully Judge Mcknight can explain a little bit more about that. And then I would say the prognosis, so this has been an annual event in Congress to try to defund or partially defund the Violence Against Women Act, and it has consistently lost, primarily in the Senate. I think there's hope that it'll happen this year, but it's so hard to know, and I would just reiterate the need to, unfortunately, contacting our congressional representatives, they're all on board with this, so it makes it hard, but there are other states where it's really very much needed to do that. So I don't know. I'm hopeful that it won't be defunded or will only be partially defunded.
And just adding to that, I don't have a directly responsive answer. I'm sorry. I know that the Act has funded and continues to provide a significant sum for judicial education, which I think has been incredibly important in raising the awareness nationally on this issue. But like you, I have been receiving information about difficulties the Act is having, and I don't have a specific answer for you.
I think two of the populations you can kind of understand why it would happen, and not that it's right, and that's sexual minorities. They did try and succeeded for many years to not allow training on abuse between lesbians and gay funded by Violence Against Women Act, and I think also illegal immigrants, probably the same thing, that because they're illegal and undocumented, that they somehow, you can't talk about it anymore or provide them services. I know also the Native American groups who were talking about colonialization were also denied funding in terms of training and technical assistance. So it could be just the training piece and the technical assistant piece and not so much the service piece, but I don't know that answer totally.
Next question.
Corleen Craft member, a couple of questions. How often are restraining orders violated? They seem to be more, from my perception, they're often just a piece of paper, and so I'm wondering how often they're violated. My other question is, what is the actual legal definition of domestic violence? Because there's such a broad range of it. It's clear that battering and assault with a weapon, but what about verbal abuse and isolation? Are those illegal, and are they enforceable?
I heard the word legal, and so they're looking at me. Oregon law has definitions of domestic violence in a variety of contexts, depending on a particular law that's involved. But by and large, verbal conduct that doesn't meet a fairly strict standard of also involving somewhat unequivocal threats and imminence of harm isn't criminalized. In keeping with what Chiquita says, though it can be part of a pattern of control, it isn't in itself strictly criminal in most contexts. The definition can vary depending upon whether you're talking about civil law for restraining orders or whether certain crimes carry a domestic violence tag. There's a lot of similarity in the definition, and the civil and the criminal ends borrow from each other, but there are a lot of fine distinctions in the law, so I can't give you a flat out, in Oregon, the law defines domestic violence as such. I think the most commonly used, just in terms of restraining orders and grafting of that into the criminal code, has to do with the injuring or the attempting to injure or the placing someone in imminent fear of bodily injury is probably common, but there is a lot more that constitutes that range of pattern and control than might be accompanied or covered by the specific legal language.
In regards to the restraining orders, there's been about 200 so far this year violations of restraining order, actually maybe closer to 225 right now. And while they are regularly violated, they can be an incredibly powerful tool as well. And a lot of it depends on the offender. Obviously, if the offender is intent on violating it, and you know, they'll violate it and they will kill people. However, in many other instances, it can be a really empowering tool for survivors of domestic violence to exert some control over their lives. And as police officers, it can help us hold people accountable.
I'm sorry. I was going to add, too, that the range nationally in what women report in terms of violence is anywhere from the low 30s to the high 60s in terms of the rate of violation. I do have the number someplace I'll find before it closes, the number of actual hearings that we have on restraining order violations per year, but it is not a high number in comparison to the number of orders that we have, and there are a whole lot of reasons for why violations might not be reported or not pursued, and some have to do with legal proof issues.
I'm going to take one question from the tables here. Could you all talk a bit about violence against men?
So yes, men are victims of domestic violence, and sometimes in patterns that are about power and control. As Maureen suggested earlier, some of the violence that gets reported against men is self-defense. We know that convicted offenders, domestic violence offenders, 100% of them claim that they are truly the victims. And so it's hard to always parse which are the credible claims of domestic violence. We know that national studies have shown that 95% of the people who are injured or repeatedly battered in domestic violence situations are women who are being battered by men. And so at the very high levels of violence, we know that it is primarily men who are doing that. And it's just really hard to find really good data in terms of what the real number and percentage is.
And men certainly do apply for and receive restraining orders. Women certainly are charged with and convicted of crimes of domestic violence. That isn't the dominant number. However, it is the obverse in terms of the typical case that we see.
I think we have time for one more question.
Carol Witherell, City Club member. So I'm wondering, do we have something of a perfect storm here that actually grooms our youth for domestic violence, especially but not exclusively boys included in that? Economic hardships, severe for many families, unemployment, glorification of violence and bullying in our media and entertainment worlds, schools, schoolyards, gun proliferation, even contact sports field. Trimming of budgets and needed services for youth and families and veterans. If I'm not exaggerating, what else should our message to our legislatures at the state and national levels be, and back to ourselves as citizens?
I know from my perspective, I think in terms of having young men avoid domestic violence, it really needs to be a male-born initiative. And I think the biggest thing that was really missing from that list is a lack of positive male role models for many of these youth, and really a lack of responsible fathers in the home. It's not surprising that if domestic violence is modeled from a young age, that people grow up to be domestic violence offenders. I'm not saying they're not responsible for their actions. I'm just saying that that's That's not surprising. And even among, and this is going to sound odd, but even in the animal kingdom, they've seen, like with bull elephants, when there's young juvenile bull elephants and there's not role modeling for elephants, those elephants will behave incredibly violent. They have issues with killing other animals. And so I think that the first step, from my perspective, is really men need to be more involved. And I think, again, that's going to start with fathers role modeling responsible behavior. I don't know if the other hosts have anything.
So in some ways, it's almost surprising that there are not more batterers in the world, given all of the factors that you just talked about and the vision of men as in control at all times. I think that part of what we have to do is to be more willing to speak out when we see things that don't seem right. I think the silence of bystanders has made perpetrators feel that they have more license to do it, victims to feel like, oh, it must be their fault, or somehow it's okay what's happening. And I just think the more that those of us who care about it and those of us who are somewhat on the outside of the domestic violence world can speak out about it in public forums. Again, my suggestion about when you have someone come and talk about school policy, about bullying, about youth development, about any of that, ask them the question, what about domestic violence? How does that impact this? How are the people that you're serving impacted by domestic violence? What do you do to stop it? That as long as we can keep raising the issue in whatever venue we're at, we have more likelihood that someone will talk to a potential perpetrator and say, hey, what you're doing is not okay. And if you have the opportunity to do that, I really recommend that you do that in a way that protects the victim from retribution.
Thank you. On that note, we've run out of time for further questions. You've clearly inspired a conversation here, and we thank you for that. Please join us next Friday when we will be here to discuss the growing impact of the Latino electorate. And as we close for today, please join me in thanking our speakers, Chiquita Rollins, Greg Stewart, and Maureen Mcknight. Thank you so much. We are adjourned.